Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Meadows Museum. I hate to do this, but I would like to remind everybody to please silence or turn off your cell phones at this time. I think I need to as well. Good call. So our program this evening celebrates a work that has been in the making for quite some time. It's our new publication, From Rodin to Plensa, Modern Sculpture at the Meadows Museum, with our guest, the author and the photographer for the book. Before I proceed, a special thank you should be made to acknowledge the role of the museum's editor, Dr. Ann Keefe, for coordinating and bringing this publication to print. So let's thank Dr. Ann Keefe. We most often tout our great collection of Spanish art here at the Meadows, and at times perhaps our great collection of modern sculpture is overlooked, even with the monumental works that we have have positioned out on our front plaza. Beyond this evening's event, I do want to make sure that everyone is aware that this summer on June 24th, we will be opening an installation of our modern sculpture on the second floor galleries as part of our ongoing celebration for this publication. Tonight's program will begin with a presentation of the catalog's author, Dr. Steven Nash, and will be followed with a presentation by photographer Laura Wilson. Following the talks, we hope that you will join us in Jones Great Hall for a reception and a book signing, and there will be catalogs available for purchase over there. Our first presenter is Dr. Steven Nash, who was the first director of the Nasher Sculpture Center and later director of the Palm Springs Museum of Art. Dr. Nash received his BA at Dartmouth College and his doctorate at Stanford University. Now retired, Dr. Nash enjoyed a 43-year career in art museums, serving as curator at the Albright Knox Gallery in Buffalo, the Dallas Museum of Art, and the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco before taking on the role of director at the Nasher. He has written widely on modern art and produced numerous exhibitions on artists ranging from Pablo Picasso to Richard Diebenkorn, as well as aspects of modern sculpture. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Steven Nash.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Scott. It's really a pleasure to be here among friends and colleagues, be back in Dallas. This project, Scott didn't mention, has a very long gestation period, going back about 12 or 13 years when Mark first asked me if I would be interested in doing a study of the very fine, but I think basically certainly understudied and probably underappreciated sculpture collection here of 30-some international modern sculptures. A lot of time then intervened and we weren't able to do the project, but finally here we are tonight, and I hope that the final result justify the long wait for it. Really a pleasure to work with everyone at the Meadows, the great staff. Mark and Bridget Marks were supporting from the very beginning. People in the registration department helped me pour through mountains of documents and photographs. They're great editor of publications. Ann Keefe marshaled the publication through editing and production, and I think you will see, if you haven't already, that it's a very, very handsome book. And many thanks to Laura for her contributions. You'll hear more about them later. I did want to make a special call out. I don't know if Deborah Carpenter is here tonight. No, Deborah, I didn't recognize you. The archivist extraordinaire at the Meadows Foundation. They were so helpful. She was pouring through old records for me constantly, answering my incessant questions. The sad thing about tonight is that Bill Jordan is not here with us to partake. Bill, as the first director of the Meadows Museum, was really the heart and soul of the beginning, the early formation of the collection, and a lot of its subsequent development as well, and was immensely generous to me with information and insights as I was researching the book. So with that in mind, I'd like to dedicate this lecture to William Jordan in his memory. There is a lot to be said about this collection, and I wish I had more time to delve into it more deeply, but I'm going to be rushing through and give you at least the overview of the history of the collection and the general high quality level that typifies this collection from really beginning to end. To get started, if I can figure this out. I'm showing you this rather jarring comparison of Murillo and Henry Moore because it spotlights a basic conundrum that lies behind the book in this lecture, actually. And that is, why does a renowned museum that specializes in the history of Spanish painting and sculpture have so much international modern sculpture around it? It seems like a non sequitur. We've got Henry Moore and Giacometti and Noguchi and David Smith and on, side by side with Goya, Velázquez, Murillo. And so why is that? And I find, in fact, that that's a question that very few people outside the immediate museum family can answer. I mean, maybe some of you remember the history of the sculpture collection, but most people don't really know what's behind it. And so tonight we're going to try to answer that question by looking at the early founding of the collection, its subsequent development, and again, that high quality level that typifies the collection. Oh, wait a minute. Here we go. So, photograph of Alger and Elizabeth Meadows at the opening of the museum in the sculpture garden and court, 1965. We have to turn back the clock to the early 1960s, at a time when the Owen Fine Arts Center was under construction here on campus as part of a general university-wide effort to increase the scope and the stature of the arts at SMU. In 1962, Alger Meadows was persuaded by university officials to donate his very substantial collection of Spanish paintings to found the new museum that was within the center. And he was also persuaded to give $1 million in cash, by the way, $700,000 of which was for endowment and $300,000 for construction costs. At that particular time, Meadows had shown really no interest or very little interest in modern and contemporary art of any kind. And it was Bill Jordan's conjecture to me that it was really his friends at the newly minted Dallas Museum of Contemporary Art who focused his attention in that direction, that new direction. People such as the Lamberts, the Murchisons, the Marcuses, Betty Blake, Nancy O'Boyle, and others who were so active in that new museum. And really helped introduce him to the world of contemporary art. So he, as the founding of the museum drew closer, he seemed to have undergone an epiphany, and that was, it had to do with the naming of the museum. So I remind you that the first name of the museum was the Virginia Meadows Museum of Art. His first wife, Virginia, sadly passed away in 1961. 1962, he met and married Elizabeth Boggs Bartholow from New York City. Of course, they came back to live in Dallas, and I think that there was this epiphany along the way about naming recognition. So this museum named after his first wife, his second wife began to think about, well, what else can we do here? Had the idea of doing a sculpture garden in front of the Meadows Museum. Unfortunately, at that point, he had no sculptures to populate such a place. So his attention turned rather suddenly and in his own personal style, of course, very vigorously to the task of building up a collection for that garden. So at this point, enter onto the scene a very charming and persuasive Italian art dealer by the name of Federico Quadrini. Federico and his wife, Odysseia Skouros, who some of you in the audience know, ran the Odysseia Gallery in Rome and then later a gallery in New York City. Odysseia is still very much with us and remembers very clearly when Al Meadows and his new wife, walked into their gallery in Rome, and he proclaimed that he wanted to perhaps find some modern sculptures, sat down, saw on the table in front of him a book that was a monograph on contemporary Italian sculpture. And so he thumbed through it and suddenly announced to everyone, to their shock in the room, that he wanted to acquire a work by every artist in that book. And as Bill said, this is typical of his art of the deal, you know, think big, act big, and leverage the prices. And so Quadrini, needless to say, reacted very positively and scurried around and put together 44 sculptures of contemporary Italian art, shipped them off to Dallas to go to the new museum. 24 of them were installed outside the museum in the court and the garden, and the 20 other ones went to the lawn of their mansion over on Turtle Creek. Unfortunately, history has not been very kind to those artists. I show you a few slides to give you a flavor of what they were about. This Luciano Minguzzi on the right, very tall abstract piece, and a very kind of ARP-like piece by Vianney on the left. Notice Joe Lambert with his pirate-like eye patch, very debonair. Here's a shot of the cover of the catalog that went along with the founding of the sculpture garden, showing some, pardon me, quite indifferent Italian sculptures and a few rather unpleasant ones in the background there. So history has not been kind to these artists, in fact. And at this point, it's Bill Jordan who comes onto the scene and plays a major role in what happens next. Bill was recruited in 1966, came to the campus in 1967. He was fresh out of graduate school in New York. He had already shown tremendous promise as a great scholar of early Spanish art, but he also, thankfully for the Meadows, had a very good knowledge of modern contemporary art as well. And one of his greatest qualifications was his manner and the way that he was able to develop with Mr. Meadows almost immediately a working relationship based on mutual respect and real trust between the two of them. They were a great pair. I mean, really, this university was very lucky to have those two together. And however, his diplomacy skills stood him very well, because no sooner did he arrive, or soon after he arrived, he sized up the Italian collection and figured this is just not up to snuff, you know, it has to go. It has to be deaccessioned, which could have been a real shock to his great patron and maybe a ticket out of town for any new director. But much to his credit, Mr. Meadows agreed. He took the advice of his new director. We know from some of his personal correspondence that he wasn't totally happy with the turn of events, but nevertheless, he sort of stoically shook off the dust and said, okay, we're going to go for it. We're going to build a better sculpture collection with your help, the two of us working together. And that really was the beginning of the modern sculpture collection. I mean, there's almost nothing left of the Italian collection. After they deaccessioned the things, sent them back to Meadows, except for just a handful of works that remained at the Meadows Museum. Only all of them but one were finally deaccessioned, and the only work that remains from the Italian collection, here's a shot from the newspaper in 1969 of sculptures being ignominiously packed up and shipped off campus. And this is the only remaining one, this Marino Marini bather, or crouching woman from 1938, which is out still in a very handsome piece on the front plaza of the museum. But again, much to his credit and his intellectual generosity, Mr. Meadows almost immediately made a gift of these two very, very important sculptures that are still at the heart of the modern sculpture collection to the museum, works that he had found himself, had acquired for himself from the Marlborough Gallery in New York, but then agreed that this would be a great basis for the build of a larger future collection of modern sculpture. So the Henry Moore piece and the Marini. I'm going to now delve into, focus on the 10 pieces that were the founding sculptures in this collection, with just a very brief resume for all 10 of them, because as we look back, it was an amazingly prescient series of acquisitions, so intelligent. All of these works have really stood the test of time as major accomplishments of modern sculpture. But the Henry Moore, we'll start with that. This obviously from his most iconic theme, the reclining figure that he worked on from early in life. The late 1920s was his first work in that vein, and then he continued throughout basically the remainder of his life. And I show you one beautiful stone carving from 1929 by Moore, and a work that was very much influential in those early carvings. I think you can see without any explanation the close resemblance between these pieces. This was a Shakmul figure from Maya culture, about 200, 300 AD. These were ritual objects, and they put bowls of sacrificial liquids on his stomach. And I hate to think about what kind of liquids went in those bowls, but they were very sacred objects and very potent influences on Henry Moore. Moore almost always worked from small maquettes or models, and I show you this one, which was his maquette for the three-piece reclining figure. These three stones are just flint stones that he picked up around his farm and studio north of London, almost to up to Cambridge. But he was always finding bones and sticks and rocks and things that became influential for his sculptural ideas. But I love the way that he then took a little pinch of clay and stuck it on the rock for his little periscope head, which of course carries over into the later sculpture as well. He had the idea about, in the late 50s, to segment his sculptures into first two segments and then finally three separate parts. And this is the first of a series of the three-part divided figures. He had the idea that these large, massive forms, it could be seen as in a relationship to nature, to the natural landscape. And he liked to think of them as rocks or cliffs or mountain ranges. He also liked the idea that the division of parts made you walk around it to see the sculpture from all angles, so you can understand it from different compositional viewpoints and also understand the way the negative space worked in and through and around the various segments of the sculptures. Then, oops, what happened to good old Marino? Okay, here he is. Marino Marini, the horse and rider. Again, his most iconic theme that he worked on for many, many, many years. There are some 50 or 60 different versions of his horse and rider. He was, of course, Italian, and so very infused with the history of ancient Roman art and Italian Renaissance art with its very large-scale equestrian portraits. And so those figured prominently behind his idea to work on this theme. And early on, before the war, this one from 1938, he worked in a very classicizing style. You see the clarity of the modeling, the poise, the static poses of both figure and rider, kind of sense of dignity that comes into these sculptures as would have befitted the earlier equestrian portraits of emperors or generals. However, during World War II, Marini was witness to a lot of fighting in northern Italy, battles that took place, and witnessed, in fact, the struggles, the violence, the terror that went with those battles. And so during that period, he began to infuse into his work a very strong political and social message. And so, in fact, the works after the war, this one from 1951, become a real, sort of slap in the face of sculptural expressionism. It's a little bit hard to tell in this slide, but instead of this smooth, classicized surface, the surface in this sculpture is scarred, it's bruised, it's kind of done with a rasp and bitten into. So it has this very rough kind of surface. The poses are not at all balanced anymore, but they are in these poses of fright or response to some terror going on. Their heads up towards the sky, both horse and rider, in signs of agony or pain. And notice that the rider has little stumps for arms. So it's really, and Marini himself said that he went from the heroic kind of representation to the anti-heroic, and he saw these horse and rider themes as symbols of loss and tragedy, modern day tragedy. So that may give you a little bit of different insight into how at least he looked upon the sculptures. Then we'll move on to the first acquisitions. They went on a kind of buying spree, actually, and within 2 years they had acquired the 2 founding gifts and then 8 more really important modern sculptures, but with great acumen and taste and vision. The earliest one in that group is the Rodin piece called Modern Muse, or Meditation with Arms, or Eve in Despair, or Inner Voice. There are all these different titles that had been applied to this work one time or another. But what it does convey, of course, is this swooning figure who is bent over and is modeled with this amazingly sensuous carving. Rodin did not actually do his own carving. He had very trusted and well-trained technicians that did all of his carving for him, but under his strict supervision. This is amazing. You just can barely keep from running your fingers over the sculpture. Don't do that. Only Mark can do that. But you had the sense of somebody in despair or torment and is bent over, the serpentine line that goes up or one side over the top of it, and then winds down the other side, conveying that sort of swooning emotion. But then notice how the figure is compressed within these two giant masses. At the base of it, a very roughly hewn block of marble, like a rock or unformed earth that she's stepping out of, and her hair is treated in the same roughly hewn way, so that you have this massive block on top forcing her down into the ground, so that you feel very empathetically, I feel, at any rate, that kind of emotion that she is going through so strongly. She comes from his magnum opus, The Gates of Hell, from 1880, and you can't see it really here, but she was on the far right of this lintel in a group of mourners on the same level as sits the great thinker. Rodin, as was his methodology, extracted this figure, as he did many figures, out of the Gates of Hell, blew her up in scale, worked in many different materials. This is the plaster model, which was seen here still in his studio in the 1890s, without arms at this point. And he produces this sculpture both with and without arms. The first version he called Inner Voice. Then he resurrected the figure sometimes with and without arms, and it became Meditation, and then it was in other compositions where it was called Muse, and then finally, when it was finally shipped during World War I to the commissioner in the United States, it somehow acquired the name Eve in Despair, which had stuck with it until very recently, and we were able to research the history. So, I mean, you can take your pick. The division of opinion on which sculpture, which title should really be used. If that work reminds you of anything, like this, maybe. Rodin, needless to say, was a great fan of Michelangelo. Then on to another figurative sculpture from the early 20th century, Aristide Mayo, and his Three Graces, or Three Nymphs. Beautiful lead cast in the Meadows. I'm sorry about these fuzzy bottoms over here. Anyway, this is a nice crisp shot of it. And there are many great photographs that Laura has in the book, as you'll see. So this is Mayo was the most prominent purveyor of the classical tradition in early modern sculpture, and a lot of people followed suit with him, but he was their leader. He kind of fomented a little bit of a reaction against Rodin. He admired Rodin, but thought that he was over-dramatizing with his poses and his modeling and the different kind of theatrical subjects that he worked with. So we have instead this classical vision, and in fact, this particular theme, and notice a composition very, very similar to the Mayo. This is a Roman fresco from 100 or 200 AD. And then here's Canova's slightly more florid neoclassical interpretation from 1814. But Mayo's version is characterized by this real sense of poise, equanimity, repose of the figures, the really clear modeling of them, and this kind of intellectualized geometric pattern that he forms. Very, very symmetrical from one side to the other. It's basically the same figure that he used 3 different times and just adjusted for the 3 different poses. These are mirror images of one another, and then the figure in the middle, except for a contrapposto pose, is almost totally symmetrical. And you can imagine the composition within a very strict rectangular box. So that kind of real formality of presentation. One thing about Mayo's work, though, that always intrigues me is that, in fact, especially with lead casts as opposed to bronze casts, which are much harder material, these lead casts always have a sense of suppleness to the skin, a sense of flexibility in the bodies. Of course, he had this paradigm of full-figured beauty that he always worked with, but it gives his work not this kind of distant, very abstract, very intellectual, ancient look of a distant Venus figure, for instance. But in fact, there is an earthiness, a real life quality to these works. And this lead cast is a very special one that's in the Meadows collection. It appealed to Mayo, obviously, very strongly, personally, because he kept this cast the rest of his life. And he put it in his own sculpture garden in Marini, France. Okay, so from Pulchritude to Starvation, a very prototypical figure by Giacometti in this well-known style, the very elongated figure, very thin, small head, large feet, very roughly worked surface. See how actively it's modeled. It brought for Giacometti that sort of general style almost immediately as he was working on these things. He's working in his mature style. From critics with an existentialist bent, the interpretations that these figures are, in fact, in their fragility and their seeming vulnerability, that they are symbolic of existentialist crisis in modern life or societal angst in modern life. He rejected that interpretation, however, and he said, forget it, I'm not an existentialist, I'm a realist. I sculpt what I see and what I feel. But his realism in his sculpting was mitigated by changing conditions of light and space and atmosphere and his emotional state as he was working with different models, and the intuitive figure working of his fingers very rapidly up and down these figures. So we have to take Giacometti with a grain of salt maybe, but these are certainly each one of these sculptures is a very unique record of an experiential process with him when he's really totally involved with the modeling. These figures were done for their other Femme de Venise figures. Obviously, he made 15 of them for the Venice Biennale in 1956, and he chose 9 of them to cast into bronze that he showed at the Biennale. And I've got a slide of the great reunion we had at the Nasher Sculpture Center 2006 in the Women of Giacometti exhibition that I helped organize, and Jed is here, he remembers it very well. I mean, this is a rare occurrence that you get all 9 of these figures together. This is the Meadows piece here on the left, the tallest of the group, actually. And there are 2 figures within this grouping that are from the Nasher collection. Oh, here's something that you might, I throw it in here because people talk about the possible influence of Etruscan bronzes on Giacometti, a tradition that he knew very well in Italy before the Roman forces took over. But they also have this very elongated, drawn out and quite sort of abstract style to them. Jacques Lipchitz, a Lithuanian sculptor who emigrated to Paris early in the 20th century. I show you this draped woman, which is typical of his Cubist period, very much influenced obviously by Picasso's Cubism. This lives in Dallas, a Margaret McDermott piece, right, Shotzi? And however, then by the late 20s, he had progressed quite a bit in his stylistic thinking and worked with much more abstract forms, much larger in scale, more kind of volumetric and outgoing, you might say. And this is the great work in the Meadows collection, the Joie de Vivre, 1927. If you look at the work from I call the backside, I'm not sure there's a back and front really, but this just looks like an abstract sculpture of big chunks of bronze winding around together in a kind of emblem of industrialization or the machine age or what have you. And on the right, however, you can see, if you look closely, these slats of bronze form the strings of a guitar, and here's a figure who is in motion, kind of holding the guitar and maybe the dancing motion, giving that kind of buoyancy that he refers to in the music that he refers to in the Joie de Vivre title. Lipschitz insisted that the work had to be seen from all sides, in fact, and so when it was installed at the villa in the south of France, belonging to the man and woman who could commission the work, he insisted that it be placed on this base out in the garden, and it was put on a kind of lazy Susan. It was a motorized base that turned the work very, very slowly. So it was one of the first examples of real kinetic sculpture, but it's a wonderful piece. Fritz Wotruba, maybe an artist you're not as familiar with. He was Austrian, trained and practiced in Austria. He had a very popular wave in the United States in the 50s and 60s. He's kind of disappeared from publicity lately. It's too bad because he has a very distinctive style, and these are important, historically important sculptures. So this is the standing man in stone, quite tall. It's out on the plaza also, and make a kind of obvious comparison with Léger's cubism, or some people called it tubism for obvious reasons, and the same kind of geometrization of forms you find in the Wotruba. Wotruba was very interested in abstract art, and I show you this piece on the right, which is a completely abstract sculpture, a kind of planar sculpture that he did, and this one, which looks like one giant sculpture, this is like 30 feet high, actually. It's not a sculpture, actually it is a sculpture in a sense, a sculptural church that he designed and worked on for the last decades of his life. But the greatest representative of that constructivist aesthetic that we're talking about, working with geometry and constructing in a kind of industrial fashion, was of course David Smith, and this great Qb8 sculpture, one of the real masterpieces of the Meadows collection. From 1962, Smith made these sculptures by forming, welding together stainless steel boxes of different shapes and sizes that he would then weld into these wonderful towering sculptures which rise up so dynamically, these geometric elements twisting and turning in different directions, and producing very acrobatic balancing acts of all kinds. And by the way, this is the Meadows piece here on the right of this photograph. I'm going to go back a second. If you just kind of come across this sculpture or look at it in most photographs, you wouldn't realize that it's a unique piece in that it's not one totally unified vertical tower, but in fact it's made out of two separate elements. And that's a very important concept for David Smith. These two, almost with a figurative kind of quality to them, but I show you Laura's wonderful detail photograph that's in the book that shows you the gap between, which for Smith was very important because as these geometric shapes rise up, it creates a kind of dialogue back and forth across that abyss, that negative space. And you can see how also he polished his sculptures to a very high degree with a grinding brush so that he put them outside. He loved to put his large sculptures outside, especially the Qb8, because they're so reflective, and he could see these dynamic contours against the open sky. The negative spaces of the sculptures opened up windows onto the landscape beyond, and of course those highly polished surfaces caught and reflected the light in wonderful different patterns. These sculptures were a great crescendo almost at the end of David Smith's life, because just 2 years later he died in an automobile crash. So this was really the great lasting monument from late in his life. I've got to hurry along here, folks. There's Oldenburg's Geometric Mouse. This is a work which he was fascinated with Mickey Mouse and turned it into geometry, and it goes throughout his life. And he used this form in so many different ways, in banners and stationery and performances. And I show you a couple of photographs. Here's the mouse house, actually. And here's this giant geometric mouse installed down in Houston. This is about 3 times the size of the one outside of the Meadows Museum. And painted red. He painted them in black, white, red, yellow even. Bill Jordan had seen the original geometric mouse, scale A, was the first one that he made. At Sidney Janis Gallery in New York, he asked about its availability. Janis said no. Nelson Rockefeller has reserved it for the Museum of Modern Art. Bill had the gumption to say, well, would Klaus Oldenburg make one for us? And I think maybe he was a little bit shocked when they came back and said, yeah, he will. So this black one and the white one at the moment were the first of these large-scale versions of the Mickey Mouse piece, which is so revered within his work in general. And finally, out of these 10 works, here's the Manzou portrait of Elizabeth Meadows, which they commissioned from Manzou. It replaced another portrait that they didn't like by an artist named Amelia Greco. And that work was given to the Dallas Museum of Art, and I had a lot of trouble finding it. Nobody at the museum had seen it in years, but it's up there in the basement of the Dallas Museum of Art. Poor Elizabeth. So I'm just very quickly, I mean, within a few minutes, going to run through the more modern part of the development of the collection. So this, of course, is the most recognizable sculpture at the Meadows, a great wave by Santiago Calatrava. It moves up and down, as everyone knows so well, but you may not know that he used that wave pattern in many of his architectural structures as well. Sometimes they're actually moving, but in this amazing roof design for this winery in northern Spain, if you look at this, you get the feeling that it really is kind of rolling up and down and along. And this wonderful drawing for the Calatrava that he made for the Meadows piece. He came to campus. I think, Mark, you talked to him when he was on campus, right? And he put together a proposal for the sculpture, and really is an icon for the museum now. And this wonderful piece, given by the Barretts, by Juan Munoz, now unfortunately dead Spanish artist who died at the early age of 48, but he made these really amazing, mysterious sculptures in which he used over and over again this figure, which is a little bit, about 3/4 life size. It's always dressed in this Mao suit. It always has the same features, facial features, and it's always in these situations of ambiguity, mystery. You're not quite sure what's going on, what the sculptures are about, what the people are thinking. And here you have him looking back over his shoulder as if responding to someone or a noise or whatever. You just don't know. But that sculpture started out, oops, what's happened here? In this environmental piece, installation piece, and the Meadows figure is here looking back into this mirror which reflects the rest of the group. So, what is going on here? This ambiguity of modern life that Munoz is always talking about, the ineluctability of these figures, the way you can't really depend on communication, the clarity of communication anymore. So I think it's one of the great sculptures here myself. And of course, everyone's favorite, the great show, marvelous piece, great selection for the entranceway to the museum by Yama Plensa. And it came to the campus, this skips around a little bit, in 2 halves, which had to be carefully put up together, and then there was worry about winds, how it would affect, strong Dallas winds would affect it. They had to develop new clamps to put it together. But it is, of course, a marvel of transparency, of lightness, of delicacy, this filigree wire that he used for the sculpture. It is monumental on the one hand, but it's also very, very quiet and thoughtful as this person is dreaming or thinking or contemplating. Again, a little bit of mystery involved. But this is the portrait here of the young girl whose portrait led to the sculpture. She was named Shou, and she was the daughter of a restaurateur guy who owned a Chinese restaurant in Barcelona, close to Plensa's studio. And he often worked from those kinds of portraits. The great towering George Ricci piece that was very generously donated by AT&T. They commissioned the piece for Ricci to go outside their headquarters in downtown Dallas. When they sold that building, they made the very generous gesture to Dallas that it should remain here and gave it to the museum, and it's installed outside the arts building just up the way a little bit. And here's George working on a very similar piece in the studio in the mid-1970s. These arms, of course, you've seen it in action, pivot and move around in the wind and make these very balletic, wonderful circular patterns. The Noguchi Spirit's Flight that was commissioned by Noguchi to honor Mr. Meadows, and there were miniatures of this stone basalt carving that were made in bronze and given to all the recipients of the Fine Arts Creativity Awards that were run by the university for so long, and amazing people like Rauschenberg and Sondheim and Ingmar Bergman and on, these great creators that came here to campus to receive the award. It's actually a helix, which is a square that then spirals up into space. And Giacometti I think, was inspired by his teacher at one point, Brancusi, who worked for in Paris for a while, with this kind of towering idea of something reaching up to the sky and his gently twisting as it ascends, and it's lifted off on this stainless steel base to give it that uplift even more. They had trouble, however, installing it because twice Noguchi came to campus to install the piece, and that base didn't fit. The post didn't fit, and so they had to take it down again and put it into storage, and it came back again. Finally got it right. So here's Noguchi, and here, looking at the sculpture, and there's Bill Jordan. Now, just very quickly, there are a group of works that are not actually in the Meadows collection, but they're in the university collection, but they're overseen by the Meadows. This wonderful James Searle's bench, which is upstairs, of course, at the top of the landing. James Searle's great craftsman-like skill with carving created this quite humorous bench called In Between, so you would sit in between these two whirling dervishes on either side of you. Typically witty but very sculptural piece. Jay Sullivan's Between with this unique technique that he had of working with plaster and straw, and this is, Jay readily admits, an homage to Giacometti's Walking Man. George Tobolowsky's piece installed along the drive as you come in or exit the university, and George is, I think, admittedly an accolade of David Smith working with his constructivist style of discarded machine parts of all kinds that are welded together in these very jaunty and spirited compositions. Finally, this piece that none of you have ever seen, I don't know if Mark has ever even seen it. John Chamberlin, because of his crushed sculpture, metallic sculpture, people always quip that they look like they come out of a car crash, but they're really amazingly great sculptures. He was a great experimenter with different kinds of materials and forms, including paper and glass and plastic and foam rubber. In fact, made sculptures out of foam rubber. And this one is made out of a paper bag that he crumpled up, painted one side of it, and then he coated with a resin. And this is an amazing object. It's one of my favorite sculptures. The problem is that the resin now is flaking off, so it needs badly to be restored. It can't be exhibited in its current state, but it's tiny. It fits in the palm of your hand. Very, very light. It's a marvelously jovial kind of sculpture. And then finally, with the redo of the plaza that opened in 2009, I think. 2007, 2009. Sculpture really found a great home, outdoor sculpture at the Meadows Museum. And I think really this redesign of the plaza, which formerly was kind of inhospitable, with much greenery and beautiful lawn spaces for installations of sculpture, works very, very well for this collection. And it's a wonderful collection that everyone in Dallas, certainly at the Meadows and the university, should be very proud of. It was great fun for me to work with it. So thanks very much. Sorry to run over. Sorry.
Laura Wilson is a photographer and author whose work has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The New Yorker, Vanity Fair, GQ, London Sunday Times Magazine, Wallpaper, and The Washington Post Magazine. She has published 5 books on her photographs. Watt Matthews of Lamb's Head, published in 1989 and reissued in 2017. Hutterites of Montana in 2000. Avedon at Work in 2003. Grit and Glory, also in 2003, and I should mention that we exhibited works from that publication here at the Meadows in 2011. And most recently, that day, Pictures in the American West in 2015, which accompanied a major exhibition at the Amon Carter Museum of American Art. Laura was elected to the Philosophical Society of Texas and is a winner of the Carr P. Collins Award from the Texas Institute of Letters. Please join me in welcoming Laura Wilson.
Well, it's a great pleasure to speak after you, Steve. That was a lovely, informative talk, and I know it's a school night, and I'm sure everyone's hungry, so I'll be brief. Let's see if we can, how do we get Scott onto this? Do you want to go back? The first one, yeah, this one. Okay. So I'd like to point out the importance in any book to the designer. So I photographed this collection, thanks to you, Mark, asking me to do it. But I felt I gave the designer a pile of pictures, and I thought, what is he? How will he make something out of this? And this particular designer, whose name is Greg Wakabayashi, is in New York, and he's the son of the famous photographer Hero, and he's one of the best book designers in the world today, and I think we're awfully lucky to have this beautiful book. And you can see the strong, striking cover and the elegant typeface, and his vision really heightened the entire pile of pictures I gave him. And I also, Bob and I came to Dallas my husband Bob and I came to Dallas in 1966. The Meadows Museum had just opened, and so my family and I came here over the years, but it wasn't until Mark asked me to do these pictures that I really had I think we all know a prophet in his own country is without glory, and so I felt that perhaps my shortcoming, that the work in the sculpture in the museum I hadn't looked carefully enough at. So I appreciate, Mark, you asking me to do this. And I think the fun of photographing the sculpture at different times of the year. So I think this picture is completely boring. I mean, even though I took it, I don't think it's at all interesting. But once you go to a different time of year, or you go in tight. Another thing that I felt in photographing the sculpture, there's a great photojournalist, his name was Robert Capa, and he photographed during World War II, and he was Hungarian and a great European photographer. You maybe know his pictures from D-Day, where they're all grainy, but they're the only pictures we have of only still pictures we have of D-Day. But he said to all photographers, if your pictures aren't good, you're not close enough. So I felt that that's this first image that I showed you of my picture of the Oldenburg. It isn't very interesting, but once you come in tight on this sculpture, the pictures, I feel, become more interesting. Whoops. And then this, I think, is just absolutely a wonderful view of the sculpture, because the strong thrust of the disc up into the sky, and then this great Texas sky. So you see the energy and the beauty and the strength, the power of the sculpture, as well as its elegance, when you see the blackness against the green grass, the blackness against the blue sky. It really, it made me fall in love with this piece of sculpture. By contrast, the very delicate and elegant David Smith, and again, coming in tight on it, I think for me, made it more interesting to photograph. I felt that I could respond myself as a photographer more to it this way. And you see what you were talking about, Steve, the reflectivity of the piece and the interest and energy and emotion that you actually get, emotion as well as motion, that you get by coming in tight and looking carefully at the sculpture. Here, the Rodin. Very beautiful marble that Steve talked about, the lovely sculptural quality of it. If you've been to the Rodin Museum in Paris, it's really a dazzling experience. And again, this was my own shortcoming. I didn't feel that I had really appreciated this piece until Mark asked me to photograph it. And I think, by seeing it in a more thoughtful way, again, coming in close and tight on it, you see the strength and the beauty of it. And then the very voluptuous, is this contrapuntal, Steve? I think it is, movement of it. And then the way that he mysteriously doesn't really explain in marble everything that he's showing you. So it's the feeling of the human form, the body, and the voluptuousness and the beauty and the softness of the skin that you see. And then this very exciting thing to see the name in the sculpture. I think, oh my gosh, I mean, it's as if I'm looking at a photograph coming out of the Dectol in the darkroom. You think, oh my gosh, this is a photograph. But imagine, you see, he did it. I mean, there it is. And also it's almost childlike, the way that he has incised the marble. And then this beautiful Plensa, which was a great deal of fun to photograph, and particularly at night, because then everything, it seems much more elemental at night. So the plaza, very beautiful, but it's not there. And the museum is not there. It's more the night sky, and then by extension the university beyond. So I think it's very beautiful at night. And this picture that I did of Plensa himself, I actually don't like a photograph of a person with their hand up to their mouth. It seems kind of pretentious, but I think that I liked this particular image of him because of the intensity of his eyes, and then his beautiful hand. He was very nice to photograph. And then looking through the Plensa and seeing again this great Texas sky, also the delicacy and the beauty of the mesh coated, painted, I guess. And then in the wintertime, the charm of it in the wintertime with the SMU Students Snowman. And again, looking through it at the, this was when it was repaired after that snowstorm. As you remember, Bridget, it was a dramatic, there were some tears in it, and it had to be repaired at great, I'm sure, time and expense. And then the Marini, I felt that this is one of the to me, one of the most appealing sculptures in the collection. I love the idea of the artist's response to a classical equestrian portrait that we're all familiar with, the horse and rider, and abstracted in this way into fear and anxiety and apprehension. And I hope I was able to portray that in a way that comes close to showing what the artist might have felt when he was working with this, and the horse, with the nostrils, even the horse, as Steve said, even the horse appears to be in agony. And here the installation, the reinstallation of the Mayo, the classical tradition of the human form. But I think this is a good example of coming in tight and close on the sculpture and giving impact to the photograph. And the voluptuousness and the beauty of the nude form and the delicacy of the touching of the hand. I hope these pictures help us all look at the sculpture in a more sensitive way than I had looked at it before. Very nice bottoms. Beauty of the female form. And the Henry Moore, again, the fun of photographing the sculpture and the weather, the changing weather, so that you could see the influences of not only rain and snow, but light giving the sculpture form. As opposed to painting, obviously you can walk around sculpture, which of course you all are much more sophisticated and you know about that. But the fun of being able to walk around, peer through, and look through sculpture. And the detail of the surface of it. I think of all the pieces in the collection. If I could have one myself, I would choose the Giacometti. And I hesitate to say why. I think it's maybe such a photographer's response. But look at Giacometti. How could you get a better face than this? I mean, he has such an amazing head. And you can see he looks a bit like his sculpture with his hair coming forward. And but he has a very, he's famously appealing looking, as you can see. But it certainly, as a young person, influenced my feeling for his sculpture. And I don't know that I need to say any more than Steve has already spoken about the sculpture and shown that amazing collection of them, of the 9 sculpture at the Nasher that was we saw recently. The elongated body and the large feet. And again, the very moving signature of Giacometti in the sculpture. I also was thinking about Leonardo da Vinci saying that the artist always paints himself. And I think that, and I also like the idea when you said, Steve, that that people think that it's about anxiety and European angst, and yet Giacometti said it's real to me. And I think that when you see his face and you look at the sculpture, that they're quite similar, and I think that's their great strength. The Calatrava, which looks so beautiful. It was fun for me to photograph a sculpture in motion, more like people that I'm familiar with photographing. And also to see it again at night and in the context of the university, the tower in the distance, and then this beautiful reflection of the water, and again in the snow. It's very mysterious, isn't it, when you see it in different lights. And another thing that was fun for me was to photograph certain things outside and then other things inside, so that they come to life, obviously, outside in a way that they aren't given that great boost inside. And then the beautiful detail, the drama of the piece up close, and then the Lipschitz. That's not very interesting, I don't think, but this maybe is better. You know, you see the great power and strength of the work, the energy and the conflict, even, of the human form. And then this very wonderful Munoz, I think, where you see European anxiety and drama in the face. And then this, I call it the bird, I guess it's called air, what is it called? Yes, yeah. But So that's a very straightforward photograph that fortunately for you, isn't in the book. But this coming in tighter on it is what, so you see the energy emanating out from the center, this small central core like a bird. So thank you very much.
We invite everybody now over to Jones Hall, and then I hope you'll have a catalog ready for them to sign, and you'll be able to talk and perhaps ask questions. Please join us.